Thank you, Meredith. I think you have given a very broad and good overview of what civil society is all about, especially in a functioning democracy. I don't know whether we are functioning democracy or we are going into failed state very soon, but I guess we have to discuss about this later on. And I think I'll let Dr. Helen Ting to start first. Yeah, is it possible? Sure.
Good morning, everybody. I think I will try to contextualize a bit more on the Malaysian society based on the more theoretical Meredith's approach. Just as a starting remark, in answer to Meredith's question, is civil society stronger or the state? I think the result is not determined yet. We will have to see. I think that is where I think the civil society needs to think. It is something that we need to keep working on. It's not something predetermined, and nobody knows the outcome at the moment. But that's what makes it exciting, I guess. Now, I try to look at civil society from a slightly different point of view. Taking the benefit of one scholar. Just a very general preamble, which Meredith has already sort of dealt with in detail, that civil society, we see it as the space between the so-called state, market, and family. So family is sort of private, and then in the public sphere, we have the state and we have the market, and we try to say, what is in between that space, where the market is not the logic of functioning or state. So somehow we say this non-space, we call it civil society. And yet, I think that as Meredith pointed out, it is a very important component of democratic life. Because if we talk about democracy, it means diversity of opinion, and also discussion and negotiation of differences, and so on. So sometimes we may have a democratic space, but the citizens may not be mobilized. And in that sense also, the democratic life would not be very dynamic, because maybe they all look upon the state to look for answer. So in that sense, actually, it is a very important site whereby we experiment. We have cooperative work, action, associational, voluntarism, solidarity, and so on. And without that, actually, democracy would not function properly. And it's understood as the school for citizens, because it promotes so-called citizenship competence. Because even if we are, we are saying that we have the right, but we may not know how to fight for our rights. And it is only through organizations that you can sort of get organized and have an impact on state policy, etc. And I think that it's not just that. It's also, as Meredith pointed out, when you become a parliamentary representative or ADUN, you start to deal with nitty-gritty of everyday, bogged down by a lot of issues, local issues, but not, you can't focus or dealt with some issues in depth. And there is where civil society come in, and they can contribute creatively. Now, I think that how is a civil society is also structured or shaped by the nature of the state. This is assumed, but I think we sort of take it for granted. But I want to bring it out because I think it's very important. So we can ask, depending on the state of democracy and nature of states, we can see that the civil society may play a very different role. Is civil society at the service of the state? For some, it may appear that way. Is civil society resisting state hegemony and defending boundary of democratic space? or state and civil society engaging or interacting in democratic dialogue, generating synergy between the state and the society. And another element I think that is important is in terms of how we understand state is what is the ideological position or partiality of the state. I think that is an important element in Malaysia because we have seen that we begin to have this debate about whether Malaysia is a secular state or is it a negara Islam, etc. And it has a great implication. And whether, before perhaps the more dominant feature of Malaysian state could be ethno-nationalist, but now more and more we see that the discourse of this religious discourse rising. I think there it is important because somehow it becomes important because of Islamism. Even in France, I think even though the law of laïcité have been there for more than a century, but in actual fact, the interest in understanding what does laïcité mean had only begun over the last few decades, partly because of the problems generated in the society. And here, so I think that it's important for us to even try to now articulate. We are independence leaders had understood Malaysia to be a secular state. But when we say Malaysia is a secular state, probably the civil lawyers are the most firm believer in this discourse and have a certain understanding. Whereas if you ask the common people, even I remember there was once some question being posed, and even the Speaker of the House, he was at a loss of saying whether Malaysia is a secular state. So it means that somehow along the line there is a loss of this transmission of memory, but I believe also it's because of the forces of civil society, certain type of civil society in the name of Islamism that is rising. Now, I just want to briefly go into two different ways of looking at civil society, the role of civil society. One is, I think what Meredith had said a lot is that it provides a space where differences, diversities, can exist, and they can then negotiate and they can sort of debate it out, and they can, But we can also say it's a space where different understandings of the good life coexist, because we are multi-ethnic, multi-religious. We have all different understanding of what a good life or a good society should constitute. And there, I think it can be a strength, so long as that space is constructively being channeled. But this is one of the way we understand the importance of civil society, because it provides a space where the state hegemony is not dominating. We still have this space whereby if we disagree, we can speak out and we can try to influence the state. Now, so we can see that this space of civil society is entrenching so-called diversity of values and voices against being absorbed or erased by the state. It's not just religion, it's even also culture. If we look at the earlier period of Malaysian history, the dividing line was ethnicity, and it was the same dynamic. You could say that, for instance, the movement to preserve Chinese education, for instance, it is in a way an attempt at preserving a certain type of culture or way of life, language and so on, and it was right against the so-called attempt of the state to undermine it. Now, so in that conception of civil society, actually associations, they exist according to their own aims, because we believe that different people would understand the objective and aims of something worth engaging in a different way. So it is also in this conception that we talk about preservation of minority cultures and way of life, and it can pose as a barrier against the so-called concentration of power and tyranny. There is another way of looking at functions of civil society, which I want to point out. That it is seen as a vehicle for the transmission of dominant values. I think that sometimes, to promote a certain social cohesion, civil society can play a role. In the sense that, for instance, I think of my constitution movement. They were trying to promote a certain understanding of federal constitution and say we should all know our constitution and know what is our right as citizens and what Malaysian state, as understood in the federal constitution, is all about. But at the same time, sometimes it could become hegemonic too, because, for instance, what do such a conception of civil society look at organizations which do not reflect the dominant values of state, And here, for instance, if you look at the so-called the nature of the state, if the state is maintaining a certain neutrality towards different religion, for instance, then I think that it will promote the first type of so-called nature of civil society. Whereas if you are promoting a certain dominant religion as the references, as the reference of governance, then perhaps this will be at stake. I will give an example later. So there is a risk of intolerance and repression. And lastly, I think here is where I understood Islamism come in. There is also a motivation of certain groups to capture the state or to subvert the so-called social order or core values represented by the state. I want to just, I think we are thin on Islamism here, but I'll let Dr. Dzulkefly elaborate on that. But I'll just quote from Dr. Farouk's article saying that Islamism entails a political ideology articulating the necessity of establishing an Islamic government, understood as a government that implements the Sharia. I think that is where our attention on hudud law and so on come in. Of course, we can understand Islamism or post-Islamism in a different way, but I think that this is where we are at the moment. If you look at the trend of Islamization in Malaysia, I would say that the rise of this so-called civil society, which promote Islamism, started in the 70s. But in the 80s, it is the state who begins to be influenced by this and say, they want to preempt it and they want to introduce an alternative understanding of promoting Islam. And yet, we see that these two processes get entangled, and now the state cannot get out of it. We can see here some of the statements made by our successive Prime Minister. I think not many people knows that even in 1982, Dr. Mahathir, in his interview with one of the press, had already said Malaysia is already an Islamic state, but of course the Islamic state as understood by him, the way he was promoting the Islamization. And when we go to Abdullah Badawi, actually that was a parliamentary response to, I think, Lim Kit Siang's query in the parliament, because Najib, as a deputy prime minister, made the statement that Malaysia has never been secular, but has always been an Islamic nation with its own interpretation. And Najib also says that it has always been driven by adherence to the fundamentals of Islam. So the opposition was very upset with that because they understood Malaysia as a secular state. So they asked the Prime Minister Badawi to make a declaration at, I think just before independence celebration, to say that Malaysia is a secular state with Islam as the official religion and so on. And Badawi does not play the game. He responded in Malay. Sorry, I should have put the Malay one. So he said Malaysia is neither a secular nor theocratic state, but an Islamic state that is administered based on Islamic principles, while upholding principles of parliamentary democracy in accordance with the highest law of the land, the federal constitution. So it's very ambiguously worded, but very obviously the term Islamic state, the secular state, is out of fashion, and many people are very hesitant to say that. I think that we can say that broadly, we are talking about, there is one camp which still says Malaysia is a secular state, and there is another camp who are not necessarily with a bad intention. They say Malaysia, if you look at the federal constitution, has a mixture. It's a mix. It's not really secular, and it has Islamic feature, but it's not a theocratic state. And there is a third group, which is in the civil society, but I argue that it's also now, they are influential actors in the Islamic bureaucracy. And also in the university. They are pushing a different vision, which is a revision of the history. It's saying that indigenous law before the land, before colonialism, it is Islamic law. So secular law is very recent, and it should conform with Islamic jurisprudence. I think we can see that, even in court deliberations now, there are certain groups which push for this type of argument. I just want to give one more example. This is a former High Court judge, Faisal Kambiji. I read an article of his which caught my attention. He's no longer a judge, but he is in the editorial board of certain Sharia law and so on. And in the article, I note that he says, Malaysia is a religious, not a secular state. And he also says the practice of other religions must be in harmony with the position of Islam as the religion of the Federation. And he also said religious freedom does not apply to Muslims. And he referred to Article 11.4. And he said it's an obvious indication of the dominant position of Islam as the religion of the Federation. And I must say that when I read the literature, he is not the only one who said that. But I cited him because he was a former High Court judge. And he was, I think, judge also for Nina Joy's case. This is another scholar. I don't know whether he is a Malaysian, but he was discussing in his conclusion in his article. And he made reference to Ahmad Ibrahim. He said, after discussing with him, he said, we are of the opinion that the word Islam in Federal Constitution is not ornamental, but an expression of vital significance and importance. It is a mandate for Operation Islamization. There is an urgent need for legislative intervention whereby Islamic law relating to conversion and its effect on marriage and matrimonial obligations is rehabilitated. Of course, forum today is not about the civil Sharia interaction, but I'm just giving examples whereby this view is becoming very influential, and it is the cause of many of our interreligious contention. And this pressure to Islamize further, even Abdul Hamid Muhammad, our former Chief Justice, commented about it. I think it's too long, I will not go into it. But just to say that, there has been a lot of social forces moving towards that direction. And so the issue about Islamism or Islamic movement in Malaysia is very, very, it is an issue that we need to look at it. Even though we have all these turmoils going on in about 1 MDB and so on, which signifies some sort of crisis in our democratic life, but this is more, just to, I have heard on BMF radio, interview of one of the Group 25. He was saying, which I agree and I have cited him a number of times, he said, the problem is the trend is like, it's very silent, it's like cancer. That means that, when it's at initial stage, we don't feel about it, but we are beginning to see the symptoms. And if we don't stop it, and it's going to get worse, and it's becoming something else, it's life-threatening. So that is the problem, and that is the nature of the Islamization trend, actually, what's going on in our country since 80s. Of course, Dr. Mahathir initiated it, but I would say that many social forces had joined it. So, So what is the role of the civil society? I think a lot of our tension and contention now is surrounding this issue, and it is dividing the civil society. It is, it is also, I think that there is a threat to if you look at the two conceptions of civil society, the Islamism is probably closer to the second one, which means that it is feeling that the civil society should also serve that ideal, the ideal of Sharia. Of course, we have to define what is Sharia, and that is another debate. But what I mean is that it is saying that, even if it's an Islamic state, it is good for the country because it respects pluralism, which I think we need a lot of debate and dialogue on that. And, it will be good for non-Muslims because it promotes justice. But we have to look at, how it works out in reality. Now, just a few concluding remarks. I think that the relevance now of this civil society, state and Islamism relationship is changing, and we see that over the decades it has transformed the nature of interaction between civil society and the state. And this changing nature of state also is fostering emergence of new divide in society. We can see that also in the increasing political awareness among Christians, for instance, because of incidents that happen, and also other non-Muslim groups. And the danger is that one vision of civil society is becoming more dominant than the other, rather than coexisting. And here, I think Malaysia, maybe we have never been absolutely democratic or very democratic, but here again is another way of challenging our task to democratize further Malaysian politics. And last of all, is a question posed to Islamism, that whether they are ready to admit that it does not have all the answers to the societal problem. Thank you.